The evening that transformed her life in ways she never imagined. The week after the reunion passed quietly, yet Emily found her thoughts constantly drifting back to that night. The laughter, the comfort, and especially Daniel's steady gaze had settled in her mind like a song. She couldn't stop replaying. She told herself it was nostalgia, a gentle kind that visits when you remember simpler days. But every time her phone buzzed, her heart lifted, hoping it might be him. Days turned into a week and still nothing. No message, no call. She told herself not to expect one. People said things they didn't mean all the time. But part of her couldn't shake the sense that something unfinished lingered between them. That feeling followed her into Friday evening. As she left work and walked through the city, her scarf wrapped tightly against the cold, the streets were alive laughter from restaurants, the smell of roasted chestnuts from a street cart, the low hum of traffic. She stopped by a small bookstore she often visited, the kind that still smelled faintly of paper and dust. The owner, Mrs. Lorne, greeted her with a kind smile. "Back for your weekend reads?" "Just browsing," Emily replied, tracing her fingers along the spines of novels she'd already read twice. And then she saw it, a familiar notebook on the display shelf. Soft brown cover, slightly worn edges, and a title embossed in gold. The Weight of Small Things. Her heart skipped. She remembered it immediately. 3 years ago, Daniel had loaned her that exact book, saying, "It's not grand gestures that change lives, it's the small ones." She had loved that line so much, she'd written it down in her old journal. Emily smiled, lost in memory when a familiar voice broke through the quiet. "I thought you'd still come here." As she turned sharply, and there he was. Daniel stood in the doorway, a little breathless, holding an umbrella damp with rain. His coat was dusted with mist, and his smile was both surprised and certain, as if he'd walked straight out of her thoughts. "Daniel," she said softly, blinking in disbelief. How did you— I wasn't sure I'd find you here," he said, stepping closer. "I was actually just passing by. And then I saw you through the window." Emily's lips curved into a small, disbelieving smile. "You saw me through the window." He laughed. "Fate has good timing, apparently." The bookstore owner smiled knowingly before quietly stepping into the back room, leaving them alone among the shelves. They stood there for a moment, surrounded by the scent of old pages and rain. The silence wasn't awkward, it was weighted, full of things neither had yet found words for. Daniel spoke first. "I wanted to call you. A few times, actually." "Then why didn't you—" she asked gently. He exhaled. "Because I wasn't sure what I'd say. I didn't want it to feel forced, but after that night, it didn't feel right to just let things fade." Emily looked down, tracing her fingers along the book in her hands. "I've thought about that evening too," she admitted. "It felt familiar somehow, like we just picked up a conversation we never finished." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's exactly how it felt." A quiet smile passed between them, soft, unsure, but sincere. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. The bookstore lights flickered, and for a moment, the world seemed to pause, as if giving them space to speak the truths they'd carried for years. Emily said softly, "When I left the publishing house, I told myself it was time to start over. But I think I also left behind people who cared. You being one of them." Daniel's voice was low. "You didn't leave, Emily. You were taking care of things that mattered. You did what you had to do." She looked at him, her eyes glistening. "You always make it sound simple." He smiled faintly. "It's not simple. But sometimes we make it harder by pretending we don't miss people when we do." That line landed like a quiet truth between them. For a moment, she didn't know what to say. She just looked at him, really looked, and realized how much she had missed that calm, grounded energy he brought into her life. It wasn't about romance, not yet. It was about belonging, the rare comfort of being understood without having to explain yourself. As rain began to fall harder outside, Mrs. Lorne peeked out and said, "You two might want to wait out the storm. It'll pass soon." They both nodded and found a small wooden bench near the back of the shop. The thunder grew softer, the sound of rain filling the space between their words. Daniel glanced around and chuckled. You know, this is where you used to come on your lunch breaks. You'd always sit by the window with a notebook. Emily laughed softly. You remember that? Of course. You said this place felt like quiet company. She smiled at the memory. It still does. The rain drummed steadily outside, and for a while, they simply sat in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but because silence itself felt honest when Daniel finally spoke again. His voice was softer. I used to wonder how you were. There were so many things I wished I'd said back then. She looked at him, her heart beating faster, but her tone calm. Like what? He hesitated, then said that your words, the way you saw the world, helped me through things you never knew about. I should have told you that. Her eyes softened. And I should have told you that your kindness kept me going when everything else felt too heavy. A pause followed, gentle, vulnerable, real. Then, as if fate wanted to mark the moment, the storm outside began to quiet. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and light from the street lamps shimmered across the wet pavement. Emily looked out the window and whispered, Maybe we were meant to run into each other again. Daniel smiled. Or maybe the world gives us second chances when we're finally ready for them. As they stepped out of the bookstore together, sharing the umbrella between them, Emily felt something stirred deep within. Not the rush of falling in love, but the quiet peace of finding something familiar again. Sometimes life doesn't shout when it changes. Sometimes it whispers through rain, through old memories, through the person who still remembers who you were before the world grew quiet, and as they walked side by side into the soft glow of the city lights. Emily knew this wasn't coincidence. It was the start of something the years hadn't been able to erase. The evening that transformed her life in ways she never imagined. The next few weeks unfolded like the gentle rhythm of an old song, and hurried, familiar and comforting in ways Emily hadn't expected. After that rainy evening in the bookstore, she and Daniel began to see each other more often. Sometimes they'd meet for coffee on Sunday mornings, sitting by the window of a quiet cafe where the sunlight spilled in soft gold. Other times they'd walk through the park after work, talking about everything and nothing. There was never anything official about it. No promises, no expectations. Just two people rediscovering the presence of one another. But beneath every smile, every shared laugh, and every quiet pause, something deeper pulsed, something neither of them dared to name. One Thursday evening, as autumn leaves drifted across the streets, Daniel called her. Do you want to take a walk? He asked. Emily hesitated only for a second before saying yes. The air that night was crisp, filled with the scent of rain and wood smoke. They met at the park where the trees were beginning to bare their branches, and the lamps glowed with a soft amber light. For a while, they walked in silence, the crunch of leaves beneath their shoes filling the spaces between their words. It was a peaceful quiet, but also one that carried questions neither had spoken aloud. Finally, Daniel said, I've been thinking about how strange it is, how people come back into our lives just when we stop looking for them. Emily smiled faintly. Maybe that's when we're finally ready to see them. He glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. Do you think that's what this is? Fate? Or just coincidence? She looked ahead at the winding path. Maybe both. Maybe life gives us choices that feel like coincidences, but aren't. He nodded slowly, his hands tucked in his coat pockets. You've always had a way of saying things that make silence feel full. She laughed softly. That sounds like something you would write in a book. He smiled, but there was something in his eyes, something unsaid, hovering just out of reach. They stopped at a small wooden bridge overlooking the pond. The water shimmered under the lamplight, catching bits of gold and silver in its ripples. Emily leaned against the railing, her breath visible in the cool air. Do you ever think about the past? She asked. All the time, Daniel said quietly, especially lately. She nodded. Me too. He turned toward her. When you left the office, I thought I'd see you again someday. But then years passed and I convinced myself I wouldn't. I guess part of me wanted to believe that if I did, things would feel the same, do they? She asked softly. He hesitated before answering. No, they feel different, better, somehow. Quieter, but stronger. Her heart tightened at his words. She wanted to say something, anything to fill the growing ache in her chest. But the right words didn't come. Instead, she said, back then, I always thought you were the calmest person I'd ever met, even when everything felt like it was falling apart. He smiled faintly. I wasn't calm. I just tried to be the kind of person people could rely on, especially you. Emily looked up at him, startled. Me? He nodded. You were trying so hard to hold everything together. I could see it. I didn't know how to help, so I just tried to be there. Her voice trembled slightly. You were. More than you realize. A moment passed, quiet, waited, fragile. The night around them felt still, as if holding its breath. Emily. The evening that transformed her life in ways she never imagined. The soft hum of the city echoed outside Emily Carter's apartment window as she sat alone at her small kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea that had long gone cold. The clock on the wall ticked quietly, reminding her that another evening had slipped by, unnoticed and uncelebrated for the third night in a row. She had come home from work, made herself a simple dinner, and watched the lights from the neighboring buildings blink on, one by one. She told herself she was fine, that this was just how life was supposed to feel sometimes, but deep down, she knew better. There was a part of her tucked somewhere behind all the routines and quiet nights that still longed for something more, not for excitement or adventure. She'd had her share of those dreams when she was younger, but for connection, a reason to smile without forcing it, a voice that reminded her she wasn't just moving through life, but living it. Emily was 31, with a gentle grace that seemed to come from both strength and weariness. She worked as an editor at a small community magazine, spending her days polishing other people's stories while quietly ignoring the one she'd stopped writing for. Her apartment was filled with books, half-burned candles, and photographs of places she had once wanted to visit: Paris, Lake Louise, the Oregon coast. But these days, they felt like memories of dreams she no longer chased. Sometimes she wondered when exactly she'd stop believing that her life could still surprise her. That night, as rain began to tap softly against the window, Emily opened her laptop and scrolled through old emails. Most were work-related, some were from friends she hadn't seen in years, and one buried deep in her inbox caught her eye. It was from Daniel Hayes. She stared at the name for a moment, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Daniel had been her coworker 3 years ago, a quiet, steady presence in an office that often felt rushed and loud. He was kind in small ways, offering to make coffee when everyone else was too busy, listening when someone needed to vent, remembering birthdays even after people left the job. Emily hadn't seen him since she'd resigned after her mother's illness. Life had swept them in different directions, and she hadn't expected to hear from him again. The subject line read, "Reunion this weekend. Would be great to see you." Her first instinct was to close the message. She didn't do reunions. She didn't do crowds anymore. But something about that name, that familiar warmth it carried, made her pause. She clicked it open. The message was simple, just a few lines. Daniel mentioned that a few people from their old team were getting together for dinner on Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just a chance to reconnect. She read it twice. Her heart caught between hesitation and curiosity. It had been so long since anyone had invited her anywhere without a sense of obligation. So long since she'd felt like part of a group, part of something beyond her quiet apartment walls. And maybe, she thought, this wasn't about a reunion at all. Maybe it was about letting herself be seen again. She leaned back in her chair, gazing out the window where raindrops traced slow, silver lines down the glass. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed 8 times. The sound was both lonely and comforting, like a memory calling from far away. Emily reached for her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found Daniel's name. Her thumb hovered over it. She could almost hear his calm voice in her mind, the way he used to say her name. Softly, like he meant it. A sigh escaped her lips. "It's just dinner," she whispered to herself. "Nothing more." But deep down, she knew it wasn't just dinner. It was a doorway, a quiet chance to step out of the world. She'd built around her pain and into something that might remind her who she used to be. Still, she hesitated. Old doubts returned. What if it's awkward? What if no one remembers me? What if I've changed too much? Her heart beat faster, not from fear, but from something unfamiliar. Anticipation. Emily stood, walking to the mirror that hung in the hallway. Her reflection looked back with tired eyes, but also with a trace of hope, the kind that had been missing for far too long. She brushed a loose strand of hair from her face and smiled faintly, as if testing what it felt like to hope again. The rain outside softened to a gentle drizzle, and in that quiet moment, the city lights seemed to flicker just a bit brighter, like the world itself was whispering, "Go." She turned back to her laptop, clicked reply, and typed just one line. "I'd love to come. Thank you for inviting me." Her fingers hovered over the send button. For one last second, she closed her eyes, taking a deep breath that filled her with something she hadn't felt in years. Possibility. Then, she pressed send. As the email disappeared into the glow of the screen, a small smile spread across her face. She didn't know what awaited her that Saturday evening. Maybe nothing would happen. Maybe it would be another quiet night in a string of many. But for the first time in a long time, Emily felt a faint hum of change in the air, like the world had shifted. Just a little, to make room for something new, and somewhere deep inside, where dreams had long been sleeping, her heart whispered, "This might be the beginning of something you'll never forget." Saturday arrived with the kind of sunlight that felt unsure of itself, soft, half hidden behind drifting clouds. Emily woke earlier than usual, her heart quietly restless. She tried to treat the day like any other. She tidied her apartment, made breakfast, even tried reading, but nothing held her attention. Every time she caught her reflection, she found herself thinking about Daniel. It had been 3 years since she last saw him, yet his voice still lived somewhere in her memory, low, kind, and steady. She remembered how, back then, his presence had always felt like calm in the middle of chaos, back when they worked together at the publishing office. Emily was the one who always stayed late, editing until her eyes burned. Daniel would sometimes pass by her desk, balancing a cup of coffee in one hand and a knowing smile in the other. "Still at it?" he'd ask gently. She'd nod, sigh, and say something about deadlines or perfectionism. And he'd just set the coffee down beside her with a quiet, "Then you'll need this." She never told him, but those small gestures meant more than he could have known. At a time when her mother was ill and the world felt heavy, Daniel's kindness had been like a small light, steady, unspoken but real. And now, 3 years later, she was about to see that light again. By the time evening fell, the sky had turned dusky pink, and Emily found herself standing outside Marlowe's Bistro, a cozy corner restaurant filled with golden light and laughter spilling through its windows. She took a deep breath, brushing her hands against her coat to steady herself before stepping inside. A familiar voice called out, "Emily, you made it." It was Claire, one of her old coworkers, waving her over to a table near the back. Emily smiled, hugging her and exchanging quick greetings with others' faces she hadn't seen in so long. There was chatter, laughter, and the kind of easy nostalgia that comes when people reunite after years apart. And then, there he was. Daniel stood near the far corner, talking with someone from their old team. His hair was a little shorter now, a little more silver at the edges, but his eyes were still exactly as she remembered, warm, thoughtful, steady. When he noticed her, his expression softened into a quiet smile. "Emily Carter," he said, walking over. "I was starting to think you'd changed your mind." She laughed nervously. "Almost did. But then I thought it'd be rude to ignore an old friend." "Old friend," he repeated, his tone carrying a touch of humor. "I'll take that." It was simple, easy yet beneath their small talk, something else hummed. A familiarity that hadn't faded with time. They joined the group for dinner, sharing stories and laughter that filled the room with warmth. But every now and then, Emily would glance toward Daniel and find his eyes already on her, as if he, too, was remembering something left unspoken. After dinner, as the group began to leave one by one, Daniel lingered near the door. When Emily walked out, he offered his jacket against the cool night air, just as he used to when the office AC was too strong. Some things never change, she said, smiling softly as she accepted it. He chuckled. Some people still forget to bring a coat. They began walking down the quiet street together, their steps falling into rhythm. For a while, they talked about work, about how their old office had moved locations, about mutual friends. But as the conversation deepened, so did the pauses, the quiet ones that carried more meaning than words ever could. Finally, Emily said quietly, "I never really thanked you for those nights you stayed late just to make sure I didn't fall asleep at my desk." Daniel smiled. "You don't have to thank me for that. I just didn't want you to burn out." She glanced up at him, her voice gentle. "You were the only one who noticed." For a long moment, he didn't reply. The sound of their footsteps filled the silence. Then he said softly, "You always seemed like you were carrying more than anyone else could see." Emily looked down, her eyes stinging unexpectedly. "I was," she admitted. "My mom was sick. I didn't tell many people." "I figured something was wrong," he said. "But I didn't know what. I just wanted you to know you weren't alone." The simplicity of his words made her chest ache in the best way. It was the kind of sincerity she hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. They walked in silence for a few more blocks. The city lights glimmered across the wet pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a street musician. Days that followed were quiet but heavy with meaning. Emily tried to focus on her work, but her mind often drifted back to that evening on the bridge, the sound of Daniel's voice, and the things that lingered unsaid between them. Each time she thought she'd made peace with her feelings. Something an old song, a book he once mentioned. The scent of rain would pull her right back. She told herself it was nothing more than nostalgia, just to old friends reconnecting. But deep down she knew it wasn't true. Something had shifted, something she could no longer ignore. A week later, she was in her office when an email from Daniel appeared in her inbox. Subject for you. Attachment. The window seat.docx. He had always been a writer, and he'd often shared his drafts with her years ago. Her heart skipped as she clicked it open. It was a short story. It began with a woman sitting by a window during a storm, watching the city lights blur through raindrops. A man once close to her returns years later by coincidence. They meet, talk, and walk in the rain, but each is too afraid to say what they feel. By the end of the story, the woman looks out the same window, whispering the words she never said to him. "You were my calm when I didn't know I needed one." Emily stared at the screen for a long time. Her throat tightened. She read the story again, slower this time, feeling every unspoken word between the lines. It wasn't just fiction. It was his heart on paper, and now the silence between them felt impossible to bear. The next evening she called him. "Daniel, are you free tonight?" There was a pause before he answered. "For you. Always." They met at the same cafe where they'd first reconnected. The place was warm and softly lit, a refuge from the drizzle outside. The hum of quiet conversations filled the air. But for Emily, it all faded when she saw him walk in. He smiled when he saw her, but his eyes carried a nervous warmth she hadn't noticed before. "Got your message," he said, taking the seat across from her. "I read your story," she said softly. He froze slightly. That, she echoed with a faint smile. "Daniel, it wasn't just a story, was it?" He looked down at his hands, then back at her. "I don't know how to write without telling the truth." Silence filled the space between them. The sound of rain tapping the windows grew louder. She leaned forward. "Then tell me, Daniel, whose truth was it?" He met her gaze, his eyes steady now. Hours. Emily felt her breath catch. He continued quietly. I've tried to forget that chapter of my life. Not because it was painful, but because it mattered too much. And when things matter that deeply, sometimes we bury them to protect ourselves. She swallowed, her voice barely above a whisper. And now? He took a slow breath. Now I can't pretend it didn't happen anymore. The words hung between them, raw and real. Emily's hands trembled slightly as she clasped them together. Why didn't you ever say something before? He hesitated. Because you were leaving the company. Because you seemed happy. Because timing never felt right. And maybe because I was afraid of ruining something that meant so much to me? She looked down, her chest tight with emotion. You didn't ruin anything. When she lifted her gaze, her eyes glistened. I used to wait for you to say something. But when you didn't, I convinced myself it was just friendship. Daniel's voice softened. It was friendship. But it was also more. It always was. The confession came like a quiet, wave-steady, tender, unforced. For a moment, neither spoke. The cafe seemed to fade into a blur of soft lights and distant laughter. Emily's thoughts swirled years of suppressed emotion, missed timing, quiet longing. Everything that had lived in silence was suddenly right there, visible, undeniable. She took a slow breath. When I read your story, Daniel, I felt every word. Because I remember that woman. I remember how she sat by the window and wished someone would understand her silence. He smiled faintly. Maybe I was trying to tell her I always did. Her lips trembled, but she smiled through it. Then maybe it's time she said thank you. His eyes softened. Maybe it's time she said more than that. The rain outside had slowed to a mist. The world washed clean. Emily reached for her bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I wrote something too, she said. He looked surprised. You did. She nodded, sliding it across the table. It's not a story. Just a letter I never sent. He unfolded it carefully. The paper was worn from being handled too many times. He read quietly. The words were simple. Dear Daniel, I hope you know you were my calm when everything felt uncertain. You never asked for recognition or thanks, but you made the world a gentler place for me. If we ever meet again, I hope I'll have the courage to tell you this in person. When he looked up, her eyes were shining. I wrote that years ago, she said. And I think this is finally that moment. Daniel folded the letter slowly, his hands steady, but his voice low. You just gave me the ending I didn't know I needed. She smiled softly. Maybe it's not an ending. He held her gaze, and for the first time, neither looked away. Outside, the rain stopped completely. The clouds parted, letting a faint moonlight spill across the window. Paint the same one where this story, in some quiet way, had begun. That night marked the turning point neither of them had expected. No dramatic declarations. No grand gestures, just truth, spoken at last, and in that honesty, there was peace. The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It was warm, full of promise. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it returns like rain, soft, quiet, and steady enough to change everything, the quiet beauty of what remains. The days after that evening passed like pages gently turning in a book, slow, deliberate, filled with quiet reflection. Emily found herself walking to work with a lighter step. Her thoughts no longer weighed down by the silence that once kept her heart still. Every so often, she'd glance at the small notebook she carried, the one Daniel had given her months ago, filled with her old quotes and pieces of hope. Now its pages were full again, this time with new words. New beginnings. She wrote about second chances, about how time doesn't erase what's real, it only reshapes it, giving love a quieter, deeper language. And though she didn't see Daniel every day, they stayed close. There were messages, small phone calls, and shared moments that didn't need explanation, because something had shifted between them. Not in fireworks or declarations, but in understanding. They had spoken their truths, and now there was peace. One Friday evening, as autumn painted the world gold again, Daniel stopped by her apartment building with 2 cups of tea. When Emily opened the door, she smiled in surprise. "You remembered my favorite blend," he grinned. "You once said tea tastes better when someone else remembers how you like it." They stepped out onto the small balcony, the city glowing softly below them. The hum of life felt distant but comforting. For a while, neither spoke. They just watched as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, its last light lingering like a promise that the day had been good enough. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "You know," he said, "I wasn't sure what would happen after that night at the cafe. I thought maybe I'd said too much." Emily turned toward him, her voice gentle. "No, you said just enough." He nodded, looking down into his cup. "It's strange, isn't it? How the things we're most afraid to say are the very things that set us free." She smiled softly. "It's not strange at all. It's human." The breeze carried the faint scent of rain and pine, stirring a sense of calm between them. Later that evening, Emily invited Daniel to join her at a small book reading. Her first public event since she'd started writing again. He agreed without hesitation. The cafe was cozy, lit by amber lamps and lined with shelves of old books. People gathered with quiet anticipation, sipping coffee, waiting for her to begin. When Emily stepped up to the small stage, her heart raced. She looked around the room and found Daniel's eyes in the crowd. He smiled, steady and sure. And suddenly the trembling in her hands eased. She opened her notebook and began to read. It wasn't a love story, at least not in the usual sense. It was about life's quiet turns, the moments that don't shout but whisper their importance when no one's listening. It was about courage, about saying what you feel before time turns it into a what if. And somewhere in between her words, the audience listened not just to her voice, but to the truth it carried. That love doesn't always arrive with noise. It sometimes walks in softly, unannounced, and changes everything. When she finished, the room fell silent for a long moment before gentle applause filled the air. Emily smiled, closing her notebook. Her eyes found Daniel again. He wasn't clapping yet. He was just watching her, his expression quiet and full of something unspoken pride. Affection, maybe both. And in that look she understood something simple and profound. Sometimes the resolution isn't about deciding whether love is fulfilled or unfinished. Sometimes it's about recognizing that love has already done its work by helping you grow, by helping you heal, by reminding you that your heart still knows how to feel. After the event, they walked together down the quiet street. The night air was cool, the pavement still glistening from a light drizzle earlier. "I'm proud of you," Daniel said softly. Emily smiled, her breath visible in the night air. "For what?" "For not hiding anymore." She looked ahead, her steps unhurried. "I think I was never really hiding. I was just waiting to be ready." He nodded. "And now you are." They reached the end of the street where the cafe's light faded into the distance. The city stretched out before,